Well, you could watch another Netflix, soapy or something.
Yeah, maybe bring Emmanuel up there or something like
exactly.
that. Welcome back to the Gunners Club. You're here with Gunner, of course, with Seuss, and we're glad you're with us. And we're going to have quite an adventure today. Pack your bags, we're off to Mars.
Hang on. Does that mean I have to make sure I'm not overweight, only carry on luggage, or how's the go?
Yeah, there's a lot of things to consider regarding that. What should you be carrying for going for Mars? When I was a child, we used to get the books on science fiction and where mankind would be roughly about now. Mid-2020s. By now, we were supposed to be living, orbiting the Earth in great big wheels. These great big hubs.
Yeah.
Obviously didn't end up that way, but what we didn't realise was we went through these panics. We went through the fuel crisis of the 70s when the cost of fuel just kept coming up.
Oh, the oil. Yeah,
We've
the
gone
oil
through
crisis.
Some scares regarding climate change, etc. here. Changes in rain pattern behaviour and floods and droughts and stuff. So the idea was quick, you better hurry up and get off Earth. Maybe come back to the moon that we haven't been to for around 50 years. And then make our way properly to the heavens and then across to Mars. But is it really a good idea to go to Mars? Well, I've been reading a very, very interesting book. We have tried to see if we actually could live in a closed environment, similar to what we'd need living on Mars. Now, in the Arizona desert,
yes,
in
I
a place called
that.
Oracle, there was actually a building. It's about 3/4 the size of the MCG field in Melbourne, the Melbourne Cricket Ground.
Yep.
Imagine it, sort of the size of a fairly large stadium. They called it Biosphere 2 because, naturally enough, Earth was Biosphere number 1. What they did was they tried to make it as close to airtight as they possibly could, import the goods that they needed to start growing, and then they also brought in 8 humans, 4 men, 4 women. The idea was that with a little bit of work they'd be able to kickstart the ecology there, and they'd come out a year later and hopefully all still be friends and have bigger tummies than what they had when they came in. Now the reality was actually a little bit different. They actually needed, partway through the voyage, which was on Earth, to pump in oxygen because the ecology they had wasn't actually producing enough oxygen.
Oh, okay.
Now, there's been a few Asian attempts to do this as well through China and through Japan, and they also have had troubles in creating enough oxygen, so bringing in the right plants to create enough oxygen.
But hang on. I mean, okay, so this biosphere thing, when was this in action? When did they do this as the experiment?
From memory, Biosphere was in the 90s, but there's been some Asian studies since that.
Okay, but technology has come, a long way since then. Wouldn't they be able to artificially produce oxygen now?
What they actually found was that it's the plants which will absorb the carbon dioxide and will produce the oxygen. That was the main way of doing it. The problems that they had was that they didn't have adequate oxygen scrubbers. So the technology, you could say, was already there. They just didn't import that right from the very start.
Okay.
The other thing is the consideration as to whether you get men or women or both and what the ratio is, because the Japanese study found that if you kicked out some of the men, replaced them with women, you actually would have enough oxygen.
Okay.
So what does that mean? Does it mean that if you're considering a space voyage that you have only women? Well, actually, because women are more susceptible to radiation, it's actually been advocated that you don't have any women at all, that you just have men. But then remember, we're human beings, and if the long-term goal is to reproduce, both men and women are actually pretty important.
Yeah, well, you would think so. Well, unless you happen to be one of the LGBTQ type, and then
Well, I guess
men are no longer required. Apparently, according to them.
The idea is to reproduce if you can manage to do that. But funnily enough, we're not aware of anyone on record having had sex in space, and we're not aware of what microgravity will do to, let's say, the fetus, or what it will do to an embryo, or what it will do to a baby once it's actually been born. Now think about this. On the International Space Station, with 2.5 hours exercise mandated per day, you're still losing 1% bone density in your hips per month. Now for a woman, bone density in the hips
is pretty
important.
Yep.
If we thought of something like, instead of the moon gravity, going to Mars with a 40% gravity, it might actually be a little bit more optimal. Let me talk to you quickly about the moon, and then we'll talk about Mars so you can understand what the challenges are. The moon is close. It's been said by a science fiction writer that you could almost imagine that if there was a god, that he would put something within stepping distance for us to eventually reach the heavens. Mm-hmm. As you can think of that as you will.
Yeah.
But because it's so close, it means a lot of people are racing for the moon. Some people are thinking we're in danger of it being similar to the Oklahoma land grab, where they basically let the wagons go and you plant your flag and you've got it. The moon is actually a commons. The heavens are a commons. I don't know if you have a similar system where you live with flats. You know, used to like a body corporate, and the stairwells will be a corporate. It won't belong to one person. It will be shared in commons.
Antarctica is a perfect example.
It's a very perfect example. It's a perfect example because although there are a number of countries who have made claims to it, including Australia, no one has actually had their claim recognised. What that means, for example, is America, who hasn't actually put in a claim but reserves their right to claim, currently has bases on land which is claimed by, for example, Chile, Argentina, New Zealand, Norway. It hasn't stopped them, but it seemed to be a thing in commons. We'll talk a little bit more about that. The moon's nice and close, but the problem is the moon is really not much value. Think about us. We're made mostly of carbon, right? You're not going to find much carbon at all on the moon. It means it's not really good for growing. You think about the areas of the moon that people want. You ready for this?
Go on.
The desirable areas of the moon are basically the areas of perpetual light. Because the moon rotates at a different angle to Earth. Mars's axis is very similar to ours, which means Mars has seasons like Earth does.
Okay.
But the Martian axis is something like 1%. So you have a couple of spots on the poles, for example, Shackleton, where basically you've got almost, not entirely, but almost perpetual light. Fantastic if you want solar power for your base, and fantastic for access to water.
Although the solar power would be considerably less, wouldn't it? Being further away from the sun.
Well, I mean, the moon is, remember, it's always our constant companion.
Yeah, but we're talking about Mars, aren't we?
Yeah, Mars, almost exactly half of what we have.
Yeah, there
almost
you go.
Exactly half what we have. See, they're on the moon, but what area is actually worth taking? It's those areas at the poles, and the total amount of water on the moon is about the size of one small lake on Earth. That's it. That's all the water there is on the moon. There ain't much. We're talking about the desirable area of the moon is about 1% of 1/1000th of the moon's area. Basically nothing. Now, where do you think Bezos is looking to land at the moment? On one of those poles, because it's the desirable land.
And is he going to plant the flag? I claim this planet in the name of Bezos?
Well, can you believe that the Americans actually had the temerity to plant a national flag on the moon, when the idea is, and the agreements which have been signed, is that space exploration is for the betterment of all. There is such thing as space law. There is such thing as space lawyers. Now, get this.
I did not know that.
You can use resources on the moon. How much? We don't entirely know. They're testing that law at the moment. You can't claim any of it as your own, but you can have an experimental base set up there. So let's say that Bezos wants to set up an experimental base there, and he can also say that there is a danger area around there because rockets have to be coming and going, and it's fair to claim that, and say that this experiment is going to take quite some time. So let's take the next 100 years off. I'm going to be doing experiments here.
Yep.
Effectively, what it means is, well, it's a turf grab. It doesn't actually own it. No country owns it, but the turf has been marked. The dog has cocked its leg.
It's almost, what do you call that? It's squatting law, basically. That's what it is. You've decided to squat on that piece of land.
Okay, so let's say that America decided to do it, and America decided that they'd also have weapons up there. The agreements don't stop that. As long as the agreements are not nuclear, they actually can have weapons up there.
Wow.
If they decide they're going to have Marines up there, that's also allowed. So the agreements specifically allow for military personnel in space. Think about it for this reason. Remember all the test pilots from the US and from Russia who were the original pioneers of space? They were all Air Force.
Yeah, well, yes,
so to
they
say
were.
you couldn't have military personnel would just be ridiculous. That's
Yep.
how space
Yep.
originally was pioneered.
Yep.
But let's say that they're up there and they're claiming the resources. Well, who actually owns the resources on the moon? Well, think about it. America has brought back, I think it's about 400 kilos of space rock and effectively claimed it. Some of it is in labs for study. Some of it was given away as gestures of goodwill to other governments. For example, I went to the Deutsches Museum in München and I saw a speck that was given as a gesture of goodwill from the American government to the German government. They've claimed it as theirs. But not only that, but people are starting to actually enter markets for purchasing and selling those commodities. 4 companies at the moment are selling space materials to and from the US government for the peppercorn amount. That's a legal term where you pay a nominal amount. It's $1. So they've established a precedent of buying and selling commercially products from the moon for
Okay.
$1.
Yeah.
So that door's already been kicked open. Mars is a very different beast. Like I said, the axis is more similar to ours. The daytime is more similar to ours as well. You'd have about an extra 39 minutes a day to yourself. You could use that leisurely, enjoy your own recreation for that
Yeah,
39
well,
minutes as you were a soldier.
Well, you could watch another Netflix, soapy or something.
Yeah, maybe bring a manual up there or
That's
something
it,
like that.
exactly.
Got more of the resources that we want. So they've got carbon, for example, very thin atmosphere. It's only 1% that of Earth's. The gravity is more conducive for human beings. It's 40%. Now think about that though. How hard would it actually be to get up there, and would it be worthwhile doing? It would take you 6 months with a rocket at best to get to Mars. And when you were there, you would have to stay at least a further year, because the way that the orbits of Earth and Mars work, we fall out of sync, and it means at our closest point, travelling at light speed, and I'm using light speed because let's say you're on the phone and you're complaining to mission control on Earth that you just can't quite properly close the door, and is there a workaround? At best, it would take 4 minutes for your signal to get back to Earth and 4 minutes for them to radio you back.
This is at the
From Mars,
this
at
is
closest.
at the
sync to Earth.
closest point. Okay.
At furthest sync from Earth, it would take 24 minutes each way for the
Wow.
communication.
Okay.
It's quite some distance away. Just how do humans go when they work together?
Yeah.
Well, in Biosphere 2, the group of 8 people split from one group into 2 groups. And there was a random run-by sputum attack where 2 people from one group spat on a woman from the other group. The 2 groups would decide to have meals at separate times, use the commons areas at separate times, not to talk to each other, not to even make eye contact.
Almost Lord of the Flies, isn't it?
It's a little bit, I've got the conch.
Yeah. Wow. Yes.
The men lost a lot of weight, about 20% of their body weight. The women around 10% of their body weight. And they worked basically as farmers for 5.5 days per week. What you find is you bring a whole lot of species with you and you hope that some of them will be successful. As it turned out, they were right. Some of them were, and a lot of them weren't. They were doing things like cooking stuff at the wrong time and mildly poisoning themselves. But some of these things can actually be worked out. This was a biosphere of 8 people. Now, the International Space Station in space needs to get a part imported. I like to say that imported from Earth. That's probably true. Imported from Earth about once every 4 to 5 months. If they don't do that, the whole show ends.
Okay.
Now, that International Space Station in American dollars cost about, I think it was $180 billion to make.
Oh, to originally make.
Yeah, it's not very big. It's the size of a few vans really stuck together. If we're talking about a meaningful settlement on Mars, where we have, and a meaningful settlement is a settlement that is self-sufficient, that will be able to stand alone in terms of energy production, food production, and humanity production from Earth.
But that would have to be considerably bigger than 8 people.
Yeah, so you'd need it geographically about the size of twice the city of Singapore.
Really?
Yeah, so we're talking about,
Really?
oh my God, big.
Wow. That big.
People are funny. when they work together. Sometimes they work together very well,
Wow.
and sometimes they don't. One of the ways that we've made sure that people work together in submarines, for example, or Antarctic bases, is the number one thing. It's the way that you vet the people. You make sure that you're getting the right people who can actually cope under the stress. And actually, to be honest, when you think about it, Antarctic bases do very, very well. They're closed all the way through the winter. When I lived in Tasmania, the pub I used to drink at was overlooking the station where the icebreaker was launched from.
Yeah.
And that would come across from Hobart, break the ice. Usually what we do is we'd buy Russian technology, and this is a great analogy for space thing, and that would go across, break the ice and allow access to the Australian bases. Beautiful thing, but they really are closed off during the winter months. I know that for a fact because I was renting from a man who worked on the Antarctic station. And when the rain came through my roof and we tried to contact him to get my roof repaired, well, of course, it was a winter and there was no way my roof was getting repaired. It would be buckets up and down the hallway. So imagine that as a similar thing. Human beings, though, do work well together in close proximity. They do in submarines. They just do. That's been shown. And when I talk about, let's say, the moon being very starved of carbon, well, if you're on board or you're on a base, you're actually working with people who are natural meat bags of carbon working with you. What do you do if there's an emergency situation and you think that, well, not all of us are going to make it out of this alive, but some of us will if one or two get eaten?
It's called, sacrificing for the betterment of the community. Is that what it's called?
Well, what tends to happen is this. With mankind generally, and I know that you're going to talk about the South American football team that did result to that, but generally humans will ride it out together and die together. It's a strange thing about mankind. We just have that really strong empathetic bond with each other. Particularly, you can imagine if you're living in very close proximity to each other at all.
Or a survival instinct, I think they call that.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? I mean, you could say survival instinct would be to turn on the other to make sure you survive, but that's just the way humanity tends to work. Again, it's the vetting process. You can't get on the line like the people were at Biosphere 2 and talk to counsellors when things go rough. Because remember, it can be 48 minutes delay. So it's sort of like writing a letter to Dear Abby, wasn't it, in the agony columns?
What was that one? What was that one in The Truth?
Oh. See, no one ever bought The Truth with the page 3 topless girls. That magazine was always found on the train. Funny thing happens is the other day I managed to find, it was left behind,
a
copy of The Truth.
Yeah.
How would you power a station on Mars? There's a number of ways you could look to do it. You'd have half the solar supply, energy you had on Earth, but you'd actually have to have surprisingly large fields of solar.
There's no wind up there, is there?
There is wind, but it's very, very light. It's light enough to blow the dust. Both Mars and the Moon have... It's similar to a silicon dust. They call it ragolith. Rago is the ancient Greek word for a blanket because it blankets you. And lith is the Greek word for stone. It's not been worn away by the wind. It's not been worn away by water. So it's a very rough, jagged, silicon, dark coloured sort of rock, which is their dust. What that means is once you get it on you, it's really hard to get off.
Is that right?
And they talk about, well, maybe the chambers to get into your settlement should be an antechamber that gets rid of the dust. Or you should just simply have your spacesuit hanging out the entrance, and it's one of those where you climb into it front forward, and then you walk outside so you don't bring the dust inside with you. In Australia, they've started to make the manufacture of a lot of bathroom stoneware and kitchen stoneware illegal to be made out of that silicon because of silicosis. You breathe it in, and it starts to scar your lungs and basically kills you at the end.
They haven't stopped making those stone bench tops. All they've done is remove the silica or greatly reduce the actual silica,
which is exactly what the ragolith is on Mars and on the Moon. They've actually tried to use moon soil on Earth and in the space station and add nutrients to it to see if they can actually get plants to grow. If you add enough nutrients, yes, you can. The leaves start to be red, which is a common sign of distress, and they don't grow very well. There's not a lot of carbon on the Moon. There's a few easy-to-reach bags, and they basically contain human urine, shit, and vomit, and that's basically carbon. that you've got there. On the moon, it's a lot richer. You can bring this stuff up. I think the problems that you're bringing up, though, are really humanity's problems. The psychological problems, our propensity to see ourselves always as different than other people. They've tried to mend that with the ISS, and at the moment, above us right now, we do have astronauts and cosmonauts from America and Russia effectively working together.
Yep.
Now,
isn't it amazing how in space they seem to be able to work together? When you come down to terra firma, they're at each other's throats.
they're working together, but they're working under different laws. So if you're a cosmonaut, you're still working under Russian law when you're up there. But if you're in a chamber which was built by the Americans, territorial, you're also operating under American law. So what that means is Americans are always surprised to discover in the Russian chambers the bottles of vodka and things like that an astronaut's not allowed to. But let's say a cosmonaut's allowed vodka, for example. I would imagine a spaceonaut is allowed to bring brandy or wine.
Yeah.
So spaceonaut is basically someone who flies to the stars from France, or a taikonaut from China. So they've got their own indigenous names. Since 2022, the rockets which have most been serving the ISS are SpaceX. Now, the Russians still have their own
Elon.
indigenous program. And like we've said, Jeff Bezos as well has got his project to the moon.
Yep.
India is starting to launch craft onto the moon, and China is starting to announce that they're very deeply interested in the moon as well. Like it or not, we are territorially going to encroach on space. So what is space? You can really define it. This is a beautiful definition that was done in the 50s by a Navy man. He said, space is whatever you can defend with your guns.
Can't argue with that.
It's
How logical is that?
But now you've got hot air balloons that can broach above 20 kilometres into the air, and some would argue that's space. The most accepted definition is that space is the area that cannot be reached by an aeroplane. So you no longer have the atmosphere to be able to feed the turbines.
Yep.
So you're going to need actually rockets, chemical rockets, to get up there. Generally, that's about 100 kilometres up. Certainly the ISS is well within that, 100 kilometres plus. And then some people actually say, no, it's a much higher band than that. It's about 1,000 kilometres, which really only puts the people who have made it to the moon.
Yeah, of
And there
course.
haven't been anyone there for 50 years. What to do when you're in space? Well, remember, it's going to take 6 months to get to Mars. I remember some of the army camps we used to do. I think, Seuss, there were at least 2 weeks, some of them. And about day 10 in, people would start calling out, is anybody here still running the anal marathon? Some people just are very reluctant to let it go. It's very cumbersome if you're in something the size of a high-ace van to actually completely go. But eventually, 9 days in, on the Gemini mission, or Gemini for Americans, one of the astronauts who was convinced he was going to hold out the full 2 weeks said, I have to go, I have to let a brown trout out. And those things can swim in space, so they're known not really affectionately as brown trout.
Of course.
You get into space, you lose your sense of taste. So the most popular thing there in space for eating is taco sauce. The spicy Mexican
Really? I
type
didn't
of
know
sauce.
that.
So much so that it's now become common practice to divvy up all of the taco sauces there in space, the little portions, and everyone gets an equal amount. That effectively becomes currency. So if you're doing, let's say, research that day and you cannot do cleaning of the head, which is your job, you can actually pay someone in taco sauce to get the job done. It's so beloved that people actually even put it on their rice bubbles or the Rice Krispies for breakfast. That's how loved that food is. People start to love the things that they're deprived of. But if you're living on Mars, imagine what things you'd be deprived of. Let's say that you get your power together. So you might have nuclear power for heating. Remember, you can't have nuclear weapons, but you can actually practice fission when you're up there. You could either have something which is basically decomposing isotope, or you could actually start the fission process and then actually get some real power happening. But remember, you're not going to get your Snickers bars in, your Kit Kat bars, your taco sauces and things like that.
What?
If it's not there and you can't produce it, you haven't got it.
What, so you don't get a resupply once every year or once every 6 months or something? Where, you know...
Yeah, so let me give you an idea of that. Let's say simply if you were going to start building, something twice the size of Singapore, let's say, which is what you need as a proper biome. You would need 20,000 rocket launches just to do that, to get the materials happening for that. Now, it could be that you start off with a stepping point in Mars. You're much lower gravity, so it's much easier to continue to fire resources from the moon. You're still going to need 20,000 rockets to do that. How many rockets do you have left to start to supply with Mars bars and taco sauces and things like that?
Well, it depends on what the payload is per rocket.
Well, that's right.
Yeah.
So oxygen scrubber or taco sauce?
Yeah. Well, when you put it like that, maybe drop one oxygen scrubber and throw in a Mars bar, perhaps. I don't know.
Once you're up in space, even if you don't have anything but ballistic weapons, and remember ballistic means something which is carried by gravity, imagine flinging a few rocks.
Oh, they go a whole lot further than on Earth.
Yeah, so you can see at the start the Americans really weren't interested in space exploration at all. Once the Salyut 7 and the Sputnik was launched.
Yep.
1957 was Sputnik. Suddenly, Earth became crazed with the idea of actually having space stations and actually having some control militarily in space. Eisenhower said that people had to be hysterical with the ideas of having space colonies. But very quickly, once Kennedy got into office and he saw just how advanced the Russians were with their space program, he announced within a few weeks of his presidency that it was something that man had to do, and not because it was easy, but because it was something that was hard. Let me tell you, it is something that is damn hard. Remember all the problems that we have here on Earth? We are like a paradise compared to what the atmosphere and life would be like on Moon and Mars. Even if we were not to mention radiation, you wouldn't be living under a glass dome, sipping champagne, looking up at Orion's belt. You would probably be covered in soil under a lava tube and working as a farmer, let's say 6 to 7 days a week, just to try and kickstart this.
Not to mention that whatever the problems we have here on Earth, we would be exporting that.
We have a problem of taking everything with us, and it was discovered even on space stations and even on the Biosphere 2, that you do end up bringing in things like scorpions and diseases and beetles and things like that you never thought that you would. The one thing we will purposefully bring in, though, that's a bit creepy crawly is insects, because the diet would most likely be on things like mealworms.
High in protein.
High in protein.
We just fed that to the chooks just a few minutes ago.
They don't mind eating food scraps. They don't complain. You never name any of them as a pet. And they're fairly versatile.
And they give you good butt nuggets.
So I hope to see you on the next adventure, maybe on the dark side of the moon. Pack your bags if you want to come to Mars.
Don't forget your excess luggage. And we'll catch you on the next one.
Will do.
To get started on Mars, we'd need some pre-made living spaces. They'd probably initially be something like those put forward by the Mars One project. A small series of contained compartments which you could link up. Therefore, it would be easy to just shut off one part when you have a problem. And when it comes to keeping the astronauts alive, well, Mars has some very important features. Thanks to the work of the first Martian, the hard-working Curiosity rover, we now know that there are all of the basic elements we need in the ground and the atmosphere, so we can create breathable air from what is already there. There is ice in the soil as well that could be used both as drinking water and to produce oxygen. There's nitrogen in the atmosphere, so we could make our favourite cocktail of Earth-style air, more or less. So that's water and air covered, but what about food? Future colonisation attempts on Mars, such as Mars One, plan to send a boatload, a spaceship load, full of fresh food to the planet in advance, so it will be waiting for the colonists when they arrive. But when that food runs out, well, let's say things get pretty grim. The Martians will live mostly on a diet of algae and insects. Food will be produced hydroponically using artificial lighting. Martian soil will be used to grow plants, and carbon dioxide for the plant will be provided from the Martian atmosphere. The nutrients for the plant, however, will come from recycling human waste. Lovely. And if we move beyond just the basics of keeping people alive, what about things like communication? Even though you've moved millions of miles away, your grandma is still going to expect a call at Christmas to explain why you aren't married yet and why didn't you get a real job rather than all this fancy space nonsense. Depending on the relative positions of Earth and Mars, a message travelling at the speed of light can take between 3 and 22 minutes to go from one planet to the other. That means phone calls are out of the question. But internet messaging will be fine, so one day the solar system will be cluttered with a constant stream of emojis. So, how's Mars? Desert icon, skull and crossbones, a sad face. One other idea that Arthur C. Clarke put forward in Voices from the Sky is that you could use lasers to beam much higher volumes of data across space. If you make use of the moon once again,